If you're really gaining revenue from this one stream, and that has just this one little thing called like copyright infringement, if you like pull that thread or whatever, and then the whole thing unravels, that's where I think people are going to end up in trouble. So the good news is I think things are going to be uncertain for a long time, and people can rely on uncertainty for a while. The bad news is it's going to be a lot of work, I think, to come out on the other end in a good spot. So by a lot of work, I mean, it's up to the companies to do a good job of like keeping good records and being really diligent with their contracts, making sure they're keeping timelines and like who's involved on what projects and who's inputting what to get what outputs. So it's, I think, a lot of record keeping and, archiving things is what ultimately is going to help, because in the end, when all this stuff shakes out and we figure out like where everything lands, then I think it's going to be going back in time and trying to figure out, what assets do we have? What do we own? What does the client own?
I'm Sarah Nagel. I've spent my career leading research and product development within some of the world's largest brands.
And I'm Chad Reynolds. I'm a serial entrepreneur and founder and CEO of Verve.
And this is AI Powered by People.
Each episode will dive into the latest AI developments and talk to an industry leader to help you better understand and utilize AI.
We'll take you inside some of the world's most famous companies and share examples of how AI is improving innovation, consumer engagement, media, and marketing.
No matter what industry you work in, we'll help you navigate one of the biggest disruptions to organizations and people today.
So, how's it going?
I'm doing good. I feel like there's something that happened in our country this past week.
We'll talk about it in the headlines a little bit. Yeah, it's a little busy. Today we're going to be sharing an interview with two practicing lawyers, Brett Renzenbrink and Megan Highmore from Dinsmore and Scholl in Cincinnati. And they're going to be talking about intellectual property law as well as advice for startups. So it'll be a good one to stick around for. All right. This week it's a busy week. We have some AI speakeasies coming up. So tonight we're going to be in Seattle in Capitol Hill at the Lab at Ada's at 5:30. So if you're in the Seattle area, please come join us. You can find the events on LinkedIn, but also just come and join us if you're in the area. And then tomorrow, November 13th, we're going to be in Los Angeles at the Rita House, which is in Park La Brea, and we're going to be starting at 6:30 p.m. So again, please join us. It's going to be a lot of fun, a lot of AI, networking, and Chad, we're going to be in LA.
Wait.
Yeah, it's going to be awesome.
Yeah.
It'll be fun. So you can head over to verve.com/events to check out these events and more. And we're going to be, in New York, we're going to be in Boston and some other cities coming up. So now we're going to turn it back over to Rex Reportwell, who's going to be reading the headlines for us this week.
The recent U.S. election has certainly stirred the pot when it comes to the future of AI. TechCrunch analyzed potential shifts in AI regulation. And folks, it's about as clear as a bowl of alphabet soup. Some companies might be popping champagne at the thought of fewer regulations, feeling those safety rules were cramping their style. But hold your horses. Those same companies could be in for a surprise if antitrust laws get a fresh coat of paint. And globally? Well, let's just say international AI collaborations might need some extra layers this winter. Trade agreements could get trickier than a Rubik's Cube, especially with China. So while some are celebrating a potential regulatory thaw, others are bracing for a different kind of chill. One thing's for sure, folks, the AI landscape is in for some interesting redecorating. Stay tuned.
Oh, Rex.
Oh, Rex and his Rubik's Cube.
Yeah.
So what do you think?
I think a lot of the regulation that, kind of came into place has primarily been at the state level. So like California and other types of companies were following suit with what they were doing around, PII and protecting people's identities and all of that. So, I think some of the regulation on the federal side, it's really difficult because it's still so early to know what things to regulate. So having oversight of people's not only their training data, but like how they're doing it all. Mm-hmm. I know there's a lot of concerns around exposing, secrets of how they're doing what they're doing. Mm-hmm. But it's really teeing up something, I think, kind of bigger maybe bigger than the state or federal level, but more on the country by country level around AI. Similar to what we saw with like China regulating the internet and what people could see. And so I don't know, it's going to be unfolding, in a lot of different facets, but I guess I'm a little bit more focused on the country by country side as opposed to federal regulation around like training data and things like that. Because I think there's other methods to, I guess, assume liability if your property was used for training data, things like that.
For me, like, I don't know, this kind of goes to like it's like a free speech type of thing. Like I go to like, should the organizations themselves be regulating the type of information that they allow people to interact with? Like, should it be a government? Should it be like a country thing? Or should it be like, it's open, do what you will. And then as an organization, you decide like how you want people to interact with your data. And kind of set those standards for yourself, because it feels like every company is different, and I don't know, it gets a little tricky when things are highly regulated like that.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's what's even more difficult is like when you try to put the same frameworks over top of AI companies as you might have put over top of social or social media companies.
Yeah,
they're just fundamentally different. One is me as a user signing up, and I create a profile and I post all my pictures, and how are you protecting me and my information and all those kinds of things, versus an AI company who's building more LLMs. They might be using the internet, kind of the open internet, to train on maybe other materials that do not belong to them, which might be fair use, but there might also be things in there that aren't. So those feel more like civil. But I wish we had lawyers that we could talk to about this.
Well, funny you should say that. I don't know. It's an interesting thing to think about, because then you also think about innovation and where you can go and like kind of what you can do. And if there's like, if there's certain rules that are in place with like what you can do with data, like, will that inhibit any sort of like future innovation? And is that, I don't know if that feels right to set that's where I kind of go to, like, it's like it should be up to the organization and how they want to deal with it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the U.S. has always been, let's say, like pro innovation, right? So we're always pushing the boundaries of what's possible, and I think using, not only regulation but also using society and culture to kind of regulate, in a way, like what we consider is good and bad and not, and how we want to behave. So I don't know. I feel like, yes, there's been downfalls to that, but I think in the end of the day is just putting as much information as you can out about it, and then giving people the opportunity to use and play around with it on their own and let them decide.
All right, Rex, what's up next?
Well, this is awkward, folks. The New York Times tech workers are out on strike, demanding better pay and, the modern perk of working from home a couple days a week. Enter the CEO of Perplexity, Aravind Srinivas, stage left, offering to lend a hand. Or rather, an algorithm. He says it's just technical support. But given that the Times is suing Perplexity for allegedly using their articles without permission to train their AI, it all feels a bit like that friend who borrows your notes and then tries to tutor you for the exam. Is this a genuine offer of assistance or a bold attempt to score points in a legal battle? We'll be watching this one closely, folks.
Are they just trying to stir the pot here? What do you think?
Passive aggressive much? No, I mean, it's great. You just stay in the news. I think for AI companies, there is a kind of like a bad rap you might get in the very beginning, because it's like, well, people throw out terms like you're stealing people's data, you're doing all these kinds of things, and there's suits that follow and all that. And I think anytime you try to do something that is helpful, I think everybody assumes there's ulterior motives and all that. So Who
It's just
knows?
the timing thing. It just kind of feels weird with like a strike, and it's just like the timing of it all that,
Right.
people
Yeah.
are like, oh, it feels
Yeah.
weird, but
We're putting you out of your jobs, but you can use our tools for free.
do we
Cool.
need you? Not sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it just is a cheap way to stay in the news.
You think it's a cheap way for Perplexity to stay in the news
Sure.
and just stay relevant?
Not so much like stay in the news as like stay relevant, but just like stay in the news cycle
Yeah.
of
Gotcha.
like, here's a company who is trying to be helpful, not hurtful. So
Yeah. We're the good guys.
we're all the good guys.
All right. Well, we'll see what happens with that. What is up, Rex? What's our last headline?
Hold on to your headphones, folks, because this news has the potential to shake up the AI landscape. Amazon, already a major player in the tech world, is thinking about pouring billions more dollars into Anthropic. Now, here's the kicker. Amazon is sweetening the deal with a catch. They want Anthropic to ditch those popular NVIDIA chips and switch to Amazon's own homegrown processors. Anthropic, understandably, is playing it coy, saying, "We'll think about it." This could be a power move by Amazon aiming to control more of the AI supply chain. Will Anthropic take the bait? Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started.
So, Jed, can you, for our listeners that may not be familiar with like kind of how this all works with like chips, can you just explain it a little bit? And you can probably explain it a lot better than I can.
I'll do my best.
Okay.
I'll do my best. But yeah, I mean, as a part of training any model, you need really two main things. You need data you can use to train it on, and then you need the computing power to do it. The chip is core in the processing speed of how fast you can do these. Otherwise, you'd be waiting for months and months and months and months and months before you can train models. And while they do take a ton of time, don't get me wrong, the processing power is core to how fast you can get back your model. So, NVIDIA has been growing like crazy over the last 2 years since OpenAI, has been training off of their chips and systems, and so it's forced a lot of tech companies to just continue to invest in like H1 processors and all different kinds of things. So I think it's just a really hot space right now for hardware, and so if Amazon is like in the hardware business and is going to invest money, then essentially giving it right back to themselves in the form of having a proven hardware, be the proven hardware provider behind Anthropic is extremely smart. It's just a matter of how bad does Anthropic need the funding to keep up, because it's not like a win or lose. It could be a win-win for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Are just because I don't know this as well as you do. Are NVIDIA's chips stronger? I mean, it seems seemingly that they're stronger right now than Amazon's would be because they're just getting into the game.
I don't know the exact specifics of like processing power with each of the chips, but I would say they would probably be on par, and then if not, it would catch up very, very quickly. So,
so it's more of an issue of like who's winning Game of Thrones is kind of what it feels like. Who's going to like kind of be the
yeah. I mean, it's definitely not like like you're going on Amazon and buy the Amazon Basics, like USB flash drive. It's like, what was as good as the the other manufacturers? So it's not so much of that kind of approach. It's I think it's just a really strategic business move, and it's up to both parties to kind of figure out, does it make sense for either one of them. I'm sure Anthropic will need to align with a hardware provider pretty soon. That makes sense. It's going to be interesting to see where these companies end up in the longer term. Are they going to stay independent or get married into one of the big guys? But
yeah, but doesn't it feel like a tech Game of Thrones a little bit, where it's like there's like these big houses that are just like, I don't know, it feels like they're just getting bigger and bigger.
They are, but you also have incumbents. Like I don't think we would have imagined we would see a competitor or somewhat of a competitor to like the big four tech companies. And I think, over the past 2 years, we've had, at least two or three kind of pop up. OpenAI, Anthropic, being another. And so you could probably throw a bunch of others in there as well. But, I think the, having access to, let's say, a globally distributed LLM, that's used by hundreds of millions of people every single day is extremely compelling. And it's going to be changing how we behave with technology. And so, yeah, I mean, the big four are 100% invested in that, kind of in that whole stack. It is going to disrupt everything that we're doing 100%. And we talked about it last week on Amazon Alexa and kind of getting into the home. And again, it's marrying software, hardware, together as an experience. And so all these companies are going to need to decide how they align. I think in the end, it's going to be interesting how a lot of the, monopoly regulations come into play here, because a lot of the big tech companies have been trying to find ways to kind of acqui-hire AI companies so that they don't necessarily kind of raise red flags around antitrust. So it's, we'll wait and see how, a new administration is handling these kinds of things, because they tried to shut some of them down and weren't necessarily successful. So it's going to be interesting to see if there's a renewed push around that, or, even with having someone like Elon in Trump's ear around this, is this disruptive to business and how, businesses grow? So is it going to go in a, so like when you are trying to assemble or like kind of create a roll up of a company, you want to pull together all different kinds of complementary services and products. When you get to a certain stage, you obviously become regulated on what you can do, so you don't have monopoly over a specific industry. And a lot of these companies have been handcuffed and not be able to make acquisitions in spaces they're already in or spaces are already a leader. And so it's caused a lot of bottlenecks for startups, because then your path is either you have to try to become profitable in a private company, you need to IPO to kind of get then return back investor funds, or you can get acquired and join an existing company, and then the investors get their proceeds back. When all of that dries up, it affects both the kind of funding markets. It affects startups, kind of like go up and die. And I think, Brett has an interesting prediction, I think, later on that we'll hear a little bit more about.
Yeah. Well, let's get to that interview, because I think that, a lot of what you're talking about, we do touch upon in the interview.
So before we get started with our interview, just a note to our listeners that what you're about to hear was a discussion between Brett, Megan, Sarah, and myself, and is not to be taken as legal advice. If you have any questions or want to reach out specifically to Brett or Megan, at the end of the interview, they're going to leave their contact details, and we can also drop them in the show notes. With that, let's get into our interview.
Well, Brett and Megan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
We're excited to have you. For our listeners, could you each introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your background. You're both lawyers. We'd love to hear a little bit more about the type of law that you practice.
Megan, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, so I'm Megan Highmore. I have been practicing patent law for maybe like 18 years, and I first started in the corporate world. So I worked in-house, and I was in a corporate legal department for like 12 years doing patents and trademarks and advertising and all kinds of different things. So from a branding point of view, that was very important. And then I've worked with startups for the last, like 5 or 6 years. And now I co-lead the venture law team at Dinsmore and Shoal with Brett. And my side of the house is the IP side. So I cover all of those things, like the patents, the trademarks, the copyright, your total branding strategy, how companies like create a moat, figure out how to be a good acquisition target. So that's kind of where we focus, or I do.
Awesome. And then, so I'm the other side of the house. So I'm Brett. And much like Megan, my lens is, I would say, a little bit more multidimensional than a normal attorney. So I actually was a founder myself. So back in 2016, I started a company with a technologist and a marketer called The Exchange, where I attempted to digitize the four walls of the legal experience, and was a little bit before my time, as I like to say it, as other people like to say it, as I was a massive failure, and it didn't work out. And so
Look
in
at
that
you now.
experience,
Look at you now, Brett. Come on.
yeah, I know. Look at what I've built. But honestly, it was the catalyst for the rest of my career. So I decided at that point that I wanted to basically take, I wanted to take the experiences that I had, all those things that I'd experienced as an entrepreneur. I wanted to apply them in the legal context. So, I today, not only am I the other half of the venture capital team in terms of from a leadership perspective, I'm doing the corporate and helping people build and scale investable technologies. I also, so one, I'm an investor myself. I also I'm on the underwriting committee for the Ohio State University's, early Ohio State Early Investor Network. And then I also act as a mentor through Ohio State, through Techstars, through Centrifuge Velocity, through Generator. And then, I'm just somebody who's a fan of the space. So day in, day out, we like to serve, entrepreneurs and venture-backed companies. But both of us, I think, have a little bit of a different lens in terms of how we look at these legal issues.
How does it feel to be on the other side? I'm curious, like going from an entrepreneur and now kind of advising a number of entrepreneurs.
Much less scary. So like, once you know the rules of the game and you're kind of like part of the fabric of the ecosystem, it's a little bit less daunting. And obviously on the other side, I'm sure that you guys have experienced, having been entrepreneurs yourself, like once you've been through it once, it becomes much less anxiety inducing. There's much less mystification. Like you kind of know what you have to do. And the second time you do it, you're better than the first. And the third time you do it, you're better than the second. And so from that lens, if I could do it again, I think I would have been much more dangerous as an entrepreneur. So it's much less scary. It was very scary back then. Now it's like, what was I thinking? But yeah, much more comforting to be the lawyer.
There's still time. There's still time. So, I mean, if you, and I know we didn't plan to go down this path, but just curious if you did do it all over again, and now you have, some of the tools at your disposal with like generative AI and all agents and workflows and all the protection that Megan can provide to you in ground cover. But how would you do it again?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, and I guess it's an interesting way to sort of talk about things that I'm interested in and have conviction in as it relates to generative AI. I mean, what I was trying to do is digitize a highly regulated industry. I mean, if you really think about what I was trying to do, I mean, in a nutshell, I saw a marketplace full of big firms that created incredible advantages. So like at Dinsmore and Scholl, for example, you have 900 some lawyers, 36 office locations, a fully robust sort of like intra info share network. You have people at your disposal that are subject matter experts. But big law firms really only represent about 20% of all of the practicing attorneys in the country. So I was trying to figure out, well, how can I extract that experience in a highly regulated industry and then democratize it for folks for the other 80% of the industry? And I was trying to do it the clunky way before any of this stuff existed. If I had done it today, there's probably some API that I could integrate with that already basically is doing it. Honestly, there's probably like a 2-second period of time when I would have been relevant before I became antiquated. But I would have probably been much smarter about how I approach, my problem solution fit. I would have been much smarter about the way that I would have done early partnerships. I would have been much smarter about tax strategy and structure. I would have found awesome lawyers like Megan who could help basically through, data use concerns and navigating sort of like sticky IP issues related to accessing confidential information. It was kind of a smorgasbord of like all kinds of issues that today are interesting from an AI perspective. But end of day, I would have probably really leveraged my advantages, which was my conviction and expertise in the area. And then I would have also leveraged generative AI and not sort of like recreated foundational models, but I would have leveraged them to try to create like interesting problem solution fit in an area where I really had expertise. And I think I would have done better. I would have made it like another 6 days than I did before. But I would have definitely been more successful today than I was 8 years ago. No doubt about it.
Yeah, can you take us through, I mean, just kind of current landscape around, new ventures that are starting, specifically around AI, generative AI, because in some cases they feel a little bit like a Russian nesting doll, where it's just like there's so many different layers that are all connected. And it's like the more you use AI, the more things it opens yourself up to from a regulation standpoint too, Megan. So, I wonder how to think about starting a company today versus maybe 4 years ago. It was pretty much like spin up an LLC, figure out what IP you're building, build software, and then go win customers. I mean, it wasn't that easy, but it was fairly straightforward compared to how you really need to think about building a venture today.
Like when I look at the venture capital landscape today, like in terms of like generative AI and the role that it plays, I think that you basically are looking at a couple of different subcategories of companies. So I think it's a little bit like, to me, I don't just say generative AI and then like, where does it fit? To me, there's like three basic ways that I look at generative AI. One is input generative AI companies, one is throughput generative AI companies, and one is output generative AI companies. On the input side, it's companies that are basically ingesting, whether it's from an LLM or some other data source, they're ingesting information that comes from generative AI models, and they're creating a really interesting use case application of that data that solves a really interesting problem. They're not creating foundational models, but they're leveraging them in a way that's unique. Number two is throughput companies, and those are basically companies who are leveraging generative AI to help the way that how they're actually serving their value proposition. So basically, they're using AI to create scale and create advantage in places where it was never possible before. And then ultimately, you've got output companies where they're just creating new foundational models. And I think each of those three present really interesting legal challenges. I mean, I think from a fundraising perspective, I think it's interesting. I mean, I really like, for example, companies that do AI agents, because I mean, I'm always the type of person, I think, rather than trying to focus on creating a new model, like a foundational model, I like the other two. I like the idea of creating really interesting problem solution fit, leveraging other language models, because I'd be of the opinion, as I sit here in a flyover ecosystem, that I'm never going to compete with, San Fran or international or New York when it comes to like foundational models. But I can create a better use case application. And then I also can be like the picks and shovels of the gold rush, where I can support other people. And I've personally seen companies find massive success being those picks and shovels, not being the next model, but being the companies that support others who are creating those models. But I think, Megan, so like from an IP perspective, I'm not sure which of those would resonate, but I know there's all like the legal issues related to pulling in artificially created intelligence. I mean, that creates a whole nother layer of risk that we have to clear on behalf of our clients.
Yeah, I would say what's been interesting over the past like 4 years or so, as people have been adopting Gen AI and kind of rolling out the companies, is what we've seen is like, oh, I'm a company that does whatever, and I use Gen AI. Versus the people who are, I'm a Gen AI company, and that's like the first thing I do. And then the second thing I do is here's my specialty. So I think we've definitely seen a refinement in that a lot over the past few years, as well as investors, what they're looking for. It's like, well, every company should be an AI company now. Everybody should be using it. So it's kind of like, how are you using it strategically? Also making sure that like broadly, IP is kind of like two buckets. It's like, do you have freedom to use it? Are you clear to use it? Are you going to get a cease and desist? Or somebody going to sue you? And then assuming all that's clear, then you get to move to the second step of like, here's what we get to own. We're going to file these, federal trademark applications or whatever. So it's those two buckets of things, and trying to figure out how that specifically, what they can own in the IP space with their AI solution. So like Brett was saying, it's more, the application of that and it's not just something basic that can apply to everything. It's more like the more niche you go and the more that you're using your experience of, your 20 years of like, brand building and creating, great consumer market knowledge tools. Those things are what's has the best IP protection chances. So it's been interesting to watch.
Yeah, and I'll add. So, Chad, you made an interesting point about kind of the way that traditional business has changed, and like through the lens of a mentor, right? So, like, just taking my lawyer hat off for a second, when I look at the companies that have been successful, right? So, one of the places where I can add value and help people like in your audience kind of like understand is where I've experienced people who have had success. And I think what's really interesting is AI. I think at first blush, you assume like in this environment, you have to have the best product. Like you absolutely must like be number one, fastest to market, get it out there, best, most sophisticated product that, is proprietary, differentiated, yada, yada, yada. Well, what's actually in my experience, at least in the places where we are, right? So like I'm not in San Francisco every single day. I'm not even in Boston or Austin or Chicago or Miami, but I do cover like 4 or 5 states, in the Midwest or in Appalachia and places, around here. And I think what's really encouraging is that if you look at the kind of those 4 dimensions of investability, which are the people, the product, the traction, and then the proof, right? So like, basically, I'm sorry, no, people, product, market, and then traction, right? So what's interesting, Chad, to your point, from my perspective, is generative AI has almost evened the playing field for people who don't have the best products. Like these throughput companies, these companies that create agents, by the way, that can like, create your throughput efficiency, make it go 10x in terms of how fast you can create your product. Well, to me, that just means the playing field is dramatically, it's been equalized from a product perspective. So the people become really important, the people and the proof. So I guess my word of encouragement to people who are out there as entrepreneurs who are like, well, I'm in Cincinnati and therefore, shucks, I'm not in San Francisco. So I'm going to be behind the 8 ball in terms of the model I'm building. I look at it the other way. I mean, everybody's working off the same models. It's the people that have proximity to traction. It's the people that actually can find, problem solution fit and sell it. It's the compelling people that really can't be replicated, and everything else is becoming sort of normalized. So I think from a mentoring perspective, that's what I'm seeing resonating with investors in the Midwest is like awesome people who are crazy conviction, crazy subject matter expertise, rock stars who have proof of some type of problem solution fit are getting ahead. And those are the people that aren't focusing on products so much. They're focusing on what makes me in a way that resonates with investors.
Just kind of going back to that, the input, throughput, output, I'm just curious about the level of investment. Are you seeing it like kind of equal across those, or are you seeing it kind of in the kind of the first 2 that you were talking about, input and throughput, and seeing more investment there?
There's absolutely there. So again, everything has to be looked at through the lens of I operate in the 2,000 miles between New York and San Francisco, right? So, I think it's a little bit different. What we excel at, in my opinion. I mean, I've seen, not just Cincy, Columbus, Cleveland, Dayton, Indy, Louisville, Lexington, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Chicago, Knoxville, Nashville. If you look at all these ecosystems, they look very similar. And there aren't that many people running around creating the next ChatGPT. There aren't that many like output foundational model creators that I've seen. It's people that have either done one of 2 things that have found success. It's people that can figure out a way to take foundational models and attach them to a more interesting problem solution fit, or it's people that have created better throughput, so basically supporters of AI, using AI to support other AI, in other words. Those are the ones that I think are resonating. They're selling more quickly, and ultimately it's finding that traction revenue that's finding investor interest.
I'd love to start to dig into kind of the who owns what and kind of AI and IP. Because with Verve and other platforms, we're creating things. We're creating outputs that are visual, that are text based, or a lot of different things. Just kind of curious about your perspective around the people that are creating it versus the people using the platforms versus the people that own the platforms, and kind of how do you tackle that? And I guess I'd love to hear your perspective, Megan.
Thanks. That's like the most interesting question of all in my mind, I guess, because it really does get to someone's like business model and like, what's the value of your company? And if you're basing it kind of on a house of cards, which is what a lot of what we're seeing these days, it's like if your foundation's not, if you're really gaining revenue from this one stream, and that has just this one little thing called like copyright infringement. If you like pull that needle or thread or whatever, and then the whole thing unravels, that's where I think people are going to end up in trouble. So the good news is I think things are going to be uncertain for a long time, and people can rely on uncertainty for a while. The bad news is it's going to be a lot of work, I think, to come out on the other end in a good spot. So by a lot of work, I mean it's up to the companies to do a good job of like keeping good records and being really diligent with their contracts, making sure they're keeping timelines and like who's involved on what projects and who's inputting what to get what outputs. So it's, I think, a lot of record keeping and, archiving things is what ultimately is going to help, because in the end, when all this stuff shakes out and we figure out like where everything lands, then I think it's going to be going back in time and trying to figure out, oh, what assets do we have? What do we own? What does the client own? So to like back up a bit, the question of like visual generators versus like AI agents, for instance, like visual generators, if you're just popping stuff in like, hey, make a, new personal care product that looks like this and has whatever, and out comes like, oh, this is what your packaging should look like, for instance. That's generally not protectable because there's not really an author. So that would be really difficult to claim any kind of copyright ownership. So if you don't have copyright ownership, I think what you need to realize is like, this is just a cost benefit analysis of like, if you're going to use these tools to expedite your business and just if speed is your main goal and time to market and just getting something out there, and you're more like a trendy kind of company, I think it's great to use Gen AI tools and to use a lot of these things to like figure out like what's going to sell the most and get it out there. And then you're fine if in 3 years it's something else, like move on to the next one. But if it's something that you're like a bit more in the traditional space, and you're less relying on like the visual, generated objects and something like if you have AI agents, if you have like some kind of like narrative tool, if you have, something that's really builds over time and is less trend based, I think those are the ones that are going to be really difficult, because what we're looking for is trying to figure out, we need some like human decision making in there, some like human creativity, because copyright law protects original works of authorship that are created by humans, fixed in a tangible medium. So we know from the courts that, and the Copyright Office, that AI can't hold a copyright. What we're still, will take years, I think, to figure out is like, who can own a copyright? And that's where that record keeping stuff comes into play, making sure that you have like agreements with all of your employees. Like if you're talking just company side, making sure you have agreements with your employees saying that like the company will own all the IP, all copyrights. It's like work made for hire and any derivative works. I think that's one thing too that people forget about is like, I don't just want the one thing, I want the rights to do everything around it. So that all those derivative works. And if we're talking more like the client side of things, like the output that they get that's produced, that's another interesting one where you might want to have really good beefy like terms and conditions or terms of use on your website or your user agreement, licenses, like those sorts of things where it says you clearly want to distinguish like what's yours, like anything that comes out of our, AI agent, like propose this, that's what we own. If it's something that you tweaked the agent or you had some impact and you had a lot of human involvement there, then maybe that's something that you would own. But you can kind of agree to that in a contract, and then whatever sorts out in court in the Copyright Office later, whatever happens. But at least you can get kind of some certainty of whether you would own something or your client would own something.
Yeah, and I'll just double click on one thing that she said about frameworks. I mean, I can't tell you. So like this basically, like the part of this that I see, I've seen it kind of, it manifests itself in two different ways, each of which like the answer was having proper frameworks. One of them was in the context of fundraising. So as you guys know, so Verve, for example, or any generative AI based company, like as you're doing due diligence, if you want to go out there and raise a couple $1,000,000, you're going to have a lead investor who's going to hire somebody like me. They're going to come in and they're going to say, kick the tires, do you own what you say that you own? Well, with generative AI, it's not always that clear. And I've gone through massive sort of like IP diligence requests, and they always ask about, do you have like safeguard frameworks against all of these the misuse of artificial intelligence? Like what are your data use policies? Do you have a generative AI policy? So I would say anybody listening to this, if you don't have those things and you intend to raise money at orders of magnitude, you will absolutely need to show to the investor, yes, we have frameworks for protection and enforcement of everything that Megan just said. The other context, we still act as like in between financings, we still act as general counsel for these companies. And I've personally seen a huge company that had basically creative-based artificial intelligence user platform. So not enterprise, this was user platform where you've got millions of people who are messing around with this algorithm and creating things. Well, we ran up against massive big like Fortune 500 companies that were saying like, hey, people on your network are using your AI to create, basically the insignia that we own. And they came in and said, you got to shut all this down. And the answer to both of those questions that saved us both times was we said, here you go. We have policies and procedures in place. We have frameworks for enforcement. We stand behind our frameworks. And therefore, we shouldn't be at the mercy of that risk. So I just want to double click for everybody that like it's not just about moat creation and academic, like who owns what. There's real dollars and cents. It'll sink a deal. Like if you don't have your policies and procedures and frameworks in place, it could theoretically have a lead say, you know what, too much risk, too much. I'm not comfortable with it, and therefore I don't want to lead this thing, which could implode your whole company. So definitely want to make sure that you have those things in place.
Yeah. So Megan, if I can go back on one of the things you mentioned, because we had Amanda Hoskins who was at P&G generating, using Gen AI to create product concepts, right? And when you put in like a single prompt, you get a visual back. You're saying like that's not protected. I guess when does it get to the point where it could be protected? So is it multiple iterations on it where you have human in the loop who, you've kind of like got into the details of like, hey, I want this here, I want this over here, I want this thing clear, I want, this kind of finish. Is that what you're talking about from a documentation standpoint?
Yep, exactly. Yep. So I think it would be like selecting the prompts like that. So if there's different points in time where I'd be like documenting like who was working on that, if there are different people working on it, it's like selecting the prompts, like putting in like, here's what we want. But when you get that back, I think like modifying the outputs or putting your creative twist on those things. So for instance, and I don't think there's any case on this, but this is what I've surmised by reading a bunch of stuff. And my advice I would give is like, in that kind of situation, if the output were like 6 different options or concepts, and then you're going to kind of like dig into those and use your, skills that you have to kind of choose which one's the lead option and then how it needs to be tweaked because of all these, different factors that come into play. I think that would probably be more along the lines of like the level of human involvement that would be needed for something like that versus you just ask a question or like, what's the best thing we should do? And here's your one option. So that, and again, that's, I think, kind of balancing like the efficiency of this and how much, if you need human involvement, you're kind of counteracting the benefits of using these systems to like just give you like, okay, what's going to be like the biggest home run? Like, we just want to go with the one versus if you want to put in the effort to kind of like distill down.
Yeah. But I guess what if so Brett, when you were mentioning agents, right? So let's say in scenario one, a single person, not like single as in not married, just like a single user, I'm putting in a bunch of prompts on like trying to generate packaging, right? So I'm getting a bunch of visuals and iterating through that process. Scenario two, I've created 27 different AI agents who I'm stringing together in a creative process, and I have spent hours and hours and hours perfecting each one of these and what are their inputs and outputs and how do they make decisions, and I press a button and it generates this package, and I'm like, this is exactly what I was looking for. I guess just kind of talk me through those two scenarios. And I guess we kind of covered off on the first one, but I'm curious on the second one of like how to think about it.
Probably, Megan, probably a good time to lay down a disclaimer that this is not legal advice for
Yeah.
Verne, right? A pretty specific question.
That's true. I usually do those. I did forget that in my intro. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know if this directly answers your question. And I'll give Megan, as the IP domain expert, a chance to think, maybe, because I think there's also one additional layer of texture to at least introduce, which is, I think that we're talking about artificial, like those input companies that are taking in artificial, like basically data that comes from one of these LLMs. I think what I'm seeing also a lot of too is companies that are not necessarily tapping into LLMs, but trying to create their own language models, or tapping into like almost like black box data streams that are not basically open language models, but are protected, basically, where you're controlling the environment from which you're getting certain streams of data. To me, the fidelity of that data and the ability to own it goes dramatically up. And I think, and as a non-IP lawyer, I think, Chad, to your question, and hypothetical number two, it feels closer, right? I mean, I think it's also fair to say that we are currently in an environment where the ground beneath our feet is moving at an unbelievable clip, day by day. We're one day away from an election, and we're, midstream on, the federal government and every single state coming out with their own generative AI policies, where the definition of all this stuff on a sliding scale is going to be changed and probably different across the country. But I do think that, to your point, there is going to be a spectrum. I think that, to me, what I see coming out of this whole thing is some type of a spectrum test, where it's like the Supreme Court says, the definition of obscenity is like, I know when I see it. And I think that this almost fits in that, where it's like, if there's a platform that's using its own data streams in a way that's in a controlled environment, where there's a human who's basically creating 28 personas that are specifically tailored to what they want to create a particular output, to me, I just see that as an interesting way to, like, rather than have a human being go through the manual process of aggregating all that information and then putting out an output, it feels closer to like you actually being the author. But again, I'm not the IP lawyer, so maybe Megan has a better answer than that.
I do think that your second example of where the person, like the prompter, is putting in more specific information about what they're looking for, that to me is, again, utilizing the human recognition of a problem, but they're also kind of identifying the solution. So we know from like patent stuff that's been provided by the USPTO that just identifying a problem is not enough. So if you're putting in, I need a package that does this,
Right.
and then whatever pops out, they're probably going to say there's no human involvement in that solution. So to have an invention, you need basically a problem solution, and it's the conception or reduction to practice is what's the patentable part, and that's the inventorship there. So I think that the significant contribution part is like what you were saying, Chad, where it's saying, well, I need a package that does this, that can withstand these temperatures in transit. It can be shelf stable for this long. It needs to have, this sprayer mechanism on it. And so giving it lots of detail about what you need and why you need it, that kind of lends itself more to the significant contribution piece, where you're going a step further than just saying, hey, help me out, like calculator, just give me all this. You're kind of like showing your work a bit more and kind of explaining like why you need something. So I think that probably would be more along the lines of, if not, copyright from the, the packaging, like the look of something, but also I think for inventorship for patent space, I think that's better, because patents protect like the functional aspects of something. So it's like the why behind why you're asking it to come out with a particular solution or concept.
Great.
I want to ask a question about training data. So like we're thinking about like we'll use the image generator example. There's a lot of images that go into these image generators, and there's artists, there's people out there that have taken photographs or they've created the art that are part of that. And you're talking about in the future, there's going to be a moment where like the dust settles and they're going to be kind of going back and tracing back to that. Do you think that there's going to be kind of similar suits, kind of like with New York Times and OpenAI, with kind of like the people, kind of with these visual generators.
I do think so. And I was thinking today, even that this whole situation right now kind of reminds me back when like web crawling and web scraping and like people just using images from wherever, and then the big image holders and those publishing houses and companies that would have those, started implementing the crawlers to see like who is using our stuff and sending more automatic cease and desist letters. So I think there's going to be a whole, cottage industry, I guess, about where people get their training materials, what's the basically like chain of custody, or like how did people get access to these things? Are they violating the terms of use that are on that website? But yes, I think it's going to be people, and it'll be, of course, people as examples. I'm sure somebody will find an interesting case that they want to create some case law, so they'll help roll the case along. But I do think that the same thing's going to happen. So that's where I think just being really diligent by reading terms of use and making sure you're using things that are open to the public, and that don't have, it might be something that's publicly available, but it could still have terms of use like, yes, this is publicly available, but if you're using it for X, Y, or Z, you really shouldn't be doing that. So just making sure you're abiding by the terms of use. But if it's just, kind of pulling from everywhere and everything, I think that's really, really tough. And so that's what you just have to realize is you're taking a risk there. It's kind of the same thing if you, for instance, were looking to come up with like brand names or logos or whatever, and pulling those kinds of things. You'd still want to do the clearance searching, like a trademark clearance search, to say like, oh, well, this is the AI agent suggesting I use like, 5 as my brand, name. But then maybe they're basing that on like the leading brand is like 4, or, there's like something that's very similar. So I think it's kind of putting things into context and still doing that like legal screen or whatever screen you would do internally of like making sure that this is something you should be moving forward with. But I just think the bigger the body of, training materials and data that you're using, the harder it's going to be to track that back.
Yeah, and well, first of all, I'm glad that Megan's on this podcast because I'm just sitting back and enjoying the IP questions being answered. So I'm really glad.
Hey, don't wait. Yours is coming.
But my only note is I'm terrified about what these regulations are going to look like. I think that it's really hard, even for people like, us that kind of like live this thing all day, every day, and people that sort of like even our software developers who have a deep understanding of artificial intelligence and data sources and where the line is between like an empathetic AI response versus a logical AI response. And I think it's gonna be really challenging for folks that are, who are native, or who are, basically migrant to the space, who aren't native to it, who are lawmakers, to try to sit back and assess any of this. And they're going to try to make bright line rules. And it kind of reminds me of when the folks at, the FTC and SEC all got together and decided that anything that has any sort of crypto element to it whatsoever, we're going to deem to be a security, and the mess that created. I'm worried. So I think it's going to be one way or the other, honestly. I think it's going to be hard to have nuance. It's going to be the moment that it's going to take them 9 months to figure it out. And the moment it comes down, it's already going to be antiquated. So they're going to have to basically say it's all in or it's all out. So I hope they basically go towards the former version and let it all in, because end of day, it's like, I think the whole thing is interesting. Yes, there are definitely misuses of it, and there are ways that you can exploit it. But end of day, it's like, if you had 1,000 people who are working on the exact same problem, if you had 1,000 human beings who are pulling from the exact same open source data sets, and then they created the exact same output, I don't see a huge legal distinction there. It's still the same common sense rules about where information is coming from and whether or not the output infringes on a third party's rights. Just because the actual how or the throughput of how we get there is dramatically improved, to me, doesn't all of a sudden like make it like illegal. So I don't know. I'm very skeptical and very afraid of what's coming around the bend here, as as it relates to generative AI policy, like Fed policy and state policy. I hope they employ common sense, and if they don't, it just makes it that much more important that you have like all of your P's and Q's 1,000% buttoned up, because the chilling effect on early stage venture companies that comply, it's already like, it's already what's coming through right now is already so expensive for early stage companies to comply. It's ridiculous. And it's only going to become more complicated. I hope they take that into consideration. Like, we need to be able to unlock innovation, not put more chains on it. But best you can do is create frameworks. Best you can do is comply, be educated. And if people are listening to this, they're already, a half step in the right direction. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the topics Sarah and I talked about was around handling PII kind of in the age of AI, which is a lot of eyes. But, over the last 5 years, we really put a heavy focus on PII. And it felt like all legislation and policies and documents that we were creating was all about protecting PII. And then this like radical shift from PII to AI. And in some ways, just a lot of the PII we are collecting, you can use AI to, hide people's identity. You can, do more summarization, and in many ways, it's hiding people's identity, kind of like in the translation from specific insight of who they are into, kind of more general insights. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how to think about companies that are out there and doing both, of working day in and day out with consumers and users and all their information, then also these AI systems and how they can intersect with one another.
Yes, I think this is super super interesting, like how PII interacts with like I think you're right. It went from like we need to lock this stuff down to like now we want to use everything and have access to everything. And I think
Right.
a little bit of it comes back to like what's publicly available, like what's being scraped off of Facebook or these different social media platforms. And if you're putting something out there that way, or if a company could figure out like, yes, we got this as PII, but they put all this stuff out there, it would have just taken us more time to locate this information. It's out there, though. I think using the information that's already out there is one thing. And there are cases where it was found that, like, hey, if that information was out there and it was publicly available, sure, you can go ahead and use that information. But the information that you're collecting from people, when they sign up for a newsletter and click the little box and they're opting into somebody's like terms of use, privacy policy, that kind of thing, I think that's where we need to be really, take another look at your terms of use, take another look at your privacy policy, think about what you're really collecting that data for, and make sure that it includes some language around AI. Like, we're going to use this and we're going to input it into whatever, because then you're putting the people on notice and they can choose to opt out. I mean, that's like one of the easier things to do, I think, is making sure that you're just getting people's input from the start. But let's say you have a giant database of all of this information and you want to use it for a different purpose. I think if there's a way you can tie it back to like what you originally asked those people for, because typically with like PII, you're only supposed to collect as much information as you like need, not that you want or you might use in the next 5 or 10 years, or this seems really interesting. Like why do you need someone's birth date if you really just need to know? That's not the end result of what you're trying to figure out. So I think a lot of it comes down to that too, is like if there's things that you can do in a certain amount of time. So this is, again, being very conscientious about what you're doing as a company. So you're collecting data. Maybe you specifically have more, I don't know, like waves of data collection where you're collecting this and then you are going to like plan ahead and do a bunch of testing on that data. And then you're going to shove the data out, and then get rid of it. And then you'll collect it again and do a bunch of data analysis. So it might be more like being more careful, I guess, of how you're collecting that data and what you're using it for. Like, do your analysis fast and then get rid of the data, and you just might have to collect more data. That might be the way to go, because then it's quick in, quick out, versus just compiling and having these giant databases that know everything about someone. I think that's going to be a little bit harder to get around.
This is an interesting one for me because, well, first of all, if you are right now building a platform where your differentiator is that you have some better mousetrap about how to harvest PII and then turn it into actionable insights on the other side, and then your North Star is like efficiency, economy, cost savings, I would tell you right now, like you better be a rock star. I mean, you better be unbelievable, because like the headwinds that you are going to hit are going to be are going to be almost insurmountable. I mean, just from the lens of the attorney lens, I mean, I see this all the time. I've seen companies fail just flat out, just because they couldn't figure out how to clear the issue of dealing with sensitive health identifier information. Like they just couldn't do it. Early, and I'm talking about early stage companies that just couldn't get over the hump. They couldn't convince people that they had a better solution for it. They didn't have the right problem solution fit, and it never worked. So I would say, like, really, really, really make sure that you have that figured out early in the process, if that's part of your value proposition, because that's a huge thing that's going to take you down. The other interesting dimension of this conversation that I've seen, so I'm on that Ohio State early investor board, and I've seen some really interesting companies that pull in biometric data. And I think when we talk about like health identifiers, the other sort of like layer of this that doesn't get spoken about a lot is the extent to which we're speaking through, like, not through input or like data about ourselves, but literally how our body is creating identifiers for us. So like, for example, if you've got technology that's reading sensors on like your eyes or the way you're walking or the way you're breathing or your heart rhythm or all these kind of things, I think there's a really interesting sort of area there too, because that's all considered to be health identifiers as well. So I think that there's a whole other element, because a lot of like what's cutting edge, at least what I see, is coming out of hospitals that deals with like biometric identifiers. So I think those companies too really need to be careful about like minding their P's and Q's and making sure that they're heeding Megan's advice and dealing with that data the same way that they would if somebody gave their social security number. It's the same way that if you read somebody's heart, breathing, or their breathing, or their the way that their heart beats. So anyway, I just want to put that out there, that there's different types of PII that people that probably aren't really thinking about.
So if AI if there's a mistake that's made or it causes harm, who is liable in that situation?
Yeah, that's fun. It's I'm not sure that either of us, it's really, because like at a great place like Dinsmore, you also have a litigation and IP enforcement department that deals with those issues too. But I mean, I can just tell you from where I sit, right? So I have absolutely seen the intermediary company in the line of fire, so the company that's actually delivering, the one that's inviting users onto their platform and bringing them into an environment where they have access to third party generative artificially created information. Those companies are still on the hook. I mean, ultimately, and Megan's probably the one that probably should be the final word on this, but it is the intermediary company. So, for example, if Verve were to have, if I have ABC Co. and I want Verve to create some marketing campaign for me, and then I pull together, 5 AI agents that do something that violates Nike's trademarks. I mean, ultimately, Verve is still on the hook. If Nike's not going to come after ABC Co. They're going to come after you, and it's going to be basically a contract chain. There's going to be a liability chain that goes back. It's going to be like who's holding the bag in terms of who has the contract with the biggest gap in it and who's indemnifying whom for misuse of third-party data. But usually it's the intermediary, in my experience, at least. I don't know if Megan, if that's your experience.
I think that's true in the cases I've seen as well. This is one of those situations where I would say, like, rely on your contracts for now when the legislation isn't clear yet. So making sure in all of your agreements, you're looking at that indemnification clause in there. You're not just kind of skimming through it. You're actually reading it. Like, is it mutually indemnification? Is the other party indemnifying me, but I don't have a duty to indemnify them. So figuring out where it gets pinned along the chain. And I think what we can also do at this point is kind of take cues from other situations where this has happened. So for instance, like if you're looking at like ratings and reviews and testimonials and like what the FTC says about things, the influencer might be saying something about a brand, but they have a duty to, make sure those claims are true. If they're not standing behind that, then the company is actually, they're the ones that are also supposed to be making sure that everything's legit and truthful and not misleading, that kind of thing. So it does fall back to the company. So it's, even if in a contract you would kind of say, well, we're just going to kick the liability back to our provider of like the AI agent. We're just going to take, we got it from them, hands off. We haven't done anything. I think that that's going to be a hard sell. But in time, it might be that the AI agent, creator does have a duty to kind of identify those things and kind of be moderating, I guess I would say, like what's really happening.
We had a situation like that, Megan, where there was a company that where they basically because we had done everything right on behalf of the company, and the terms and conditions basically deflected any and all misuse of data on their users. We were able to sit back and say, well, hey, it wasn't us. We're just, we're like, it's like the Napster defense, basically. It's like the eBay defense, where it's like, well, it wasn't us. It was them. They're the ones on here, creating the issues. And we were able to successfully make that argument, but only because we had the right terms of use in play. If we didn't have that, we would have been right. We would have been in the crosshairs.
Yeah, that's what I would say. It's like to sum up a lot of these things. It's like looking at your contracts and your terms of use and realizing those are like living documents, living, rule books or game books, I guess, where you're kind of figuring out who is going to have liability for these things, kind of like game playing out, like what would happen in these situations. Do we have it covered under our contracts? And I mean, that might not be a very long process. I mean, you could spend like 4 hours and kind of reassess all of that stuff, but it can give you a lot of peace of mind that you're in a good spot.
Yeah. Well, it feels like a lot of the responsibility is getting pushed in a greater quantity towards users today.
Yep.
Because the interface is changing. It's not like software as usual from 3 years ago, where everything was like an interface and buttons, and you can only kind of click and get so far. Now your interface is essentially a text box where you can ask anything you want to, and so it's super challenging for tech companies to be responsible for every single thing that comes back. It seems like you're putting a lot of the responsibility out into the user. Now, you obviously need to have great onboarding and instructions of how to use your systems, but just curious your perspective if you're seeing the same thing and companies giving over more, I won't say control, but just you can do a lot more things today with software than you could 2-3 years ago.
Just in general, I think you need to kind of decide what you are and who you are, like where you're going to play and where you're not going to play. So if you're going to like, you want to be involved and moderate and tweak things on the output side versus you just want to kind of be on the, hey, we're a tool. People can use this tool for whatever they want to use it for. I think what happens where you get into trouble is when you're, well, today I'm going to be this side, tomorrow I'm going to be that side, and I'm going to pick and choose. I'm going to cherry pick what I want to get involved in, what I don't want to get involved in. And I think that's where it muddies the waters. So I think as long as you like pick what you're going to be, if you want to be, hey, we're creating these AI agents, we're just, allowing you, we have the framework here, you kind of, it evolves over time into what you, client, makes it. Then I think that's definitely shifting liability towards them versus you being responsible for things.
Yeah, I think it's funny you go like this side versus that side, because what I was going to say is, like, to me, the line of demarcation between like my response is between, are you an enterprise generative AI product or are you a user-based generative AI product? Because if it's me, like if I'm Burbay, right, and my singular vertical is I'm going to be doing enterprise, basically an enterprise subscription product for companies, then I think that I'm taking a position of more responsibility just by the nature of those agreements. The way, because those, to sell into those agreements, it's a totally different play. I mean, it's completely, and if we had another hour, I would love to talk to you guys about like the companies I've seen who have had two different verticals, one that was enterprise and one that was B2C, because I have really interesting feedback. Like I've sat in rooms with Doug Leone where he talked about this, and great, awesome things I could say. But if you're a B2C, then I think it's more like Wild West to me, because what you're trying to drive, if you're a B2C product, is you're trying to drive like DAO amount, user activity, engagement. You don't want to be creating huge frameworks of like security entanglements. You basically want to take the position like we're the playground. Like people play on us all day, every day, and it's not our fault. And like there's millions of people on this playground, and like they're just doing whatever they want. This is on them.
Right.
If you're an enterprise product, you don't have that luxury. You basically, it's such a different process in onboarding, and the contractual process is so different And just quite frankly, the negotiation back from those users is so much different and more intense. You can't get away with that. Like, you basically are going to have to absorb more responsibility if you're enterprise.
Absolutely.
So a little bit like this versus that is enterprise and user.
Yeah, I mean, we've got all the scars to prove it with, like, the 3 to 5 month MSA process and going on. It is definitely completely different.
Brett, to your point, I feel like we could do this for another hour, and I think we would love to have you guys back, especially because things will change. Tomorrow's the election. We feel like things will potentially be different next time we speak. But for our listeners, where can they find out more about what you guys do, and if they may need you in the future?
Yeah, and actually, before we sign off, let me make a prediction. She can make a prediction about what the world will look like in 6 months from the IP side. I'm going to make a prediction on what the world's going to look like from the fundraising side. We can come back and we can fact check it, right? So we didn't. So Megan said the best question was the one about IP. I think the question is kind of the state of fundraising and why seed has evaporated and why it's impossible to get somebody in a flyover ecosystem to stroke a check for any company, let alone a generative AI one. There's a combination here of things, actually. So there is I'll say that if people want to find me, you can find me anywhere on LinkedIn. You can go on Dinsmore. You can reach out to us directly. Easiest places would be dinsmore.com and then also LinkedIn. I'm going to write an article about this. It's going to probably be released in the next week. I wanted to see how this went. But combination of a couple of things. COVID and remote working, default alive, the letter that came out of the YC that basically told everybody to hunker down and raise as much money as humanly possible. The YC safe, so everybody did it cheaply. They raised a ridiculous amount of money. They're over leveraged and completely diluted down to places where they must hit valuations that are ridiculously high, or they're going to have apocalyptic dilution. And when you combine that with, on the other side of the marketplace, LPs have no liquidity in funds. So therefore, when you don't have liquidity, you have super conservative VCs that aren't trying to invest in anything that doesn't make any money. When you combine those two things, what's going to happen here in the next 6 months is that default alive runways are going to run out. Okay. There is going to be an unbelievable amount of companies over the next 6 to 9 months that I think are in really, really deep trouble. And I think that we as an ecosystem need to figure this out, because you have a lot of awesome companies that are at the end of runways, and they've brought in so much money through YC safes without any understanding of the fixed dilution concept and how that's going to hurt them from a dilution perspective. In order to get a $50 million valuation, you got to have like $5 million of ARR, which nobody has. And it's such a conservative, money-driven environment. You're going to have a pinch, and you're going to have a ridiculous sort of Gatsby economy here in the next 6 months, where 20% are going to get massive valuations and get ahead. 80% are going to be in big trouble. So my prediction, and people can reach out to me, dinsmore.com, LinkedIn, try to fact check me on this. We'll talk about it in 6 months, is that we're going to have a lot of people. You're going to have a lot of failure, but that's okay. Like, people can fail. It's okay in the Midwest to tell people that that to fail and to be wrong and to iterate and to do it all over again. And I want that to be the final message that I have. So people can find me on dinsmore.com, LinkedIn, and but I want to check that in 6 months.
Just to clarify the prediction, you're saying 20% of the companies in 6 months are going to be massive successes, 80% are going to fail?
I think you are going to see in generative AI companies that the same exact companies that were raising on default alive 2 years ago, 80% of them are going to be in a pinch where they can't hit A valuations. They're not going to get through. We're going to see a huge purge of about half of them. The other half are going to iterate and figure something else out. But there's going to be a massive bubble up of valuations, because people have built product over those massive influx of capital, and they have massive. So A valuations are going to go way up. The Series seed is going to evaporate entirely. I think that seed is not even going to be a thing. It's going to be convertible instrument risk capital. A is going to be massive, and there's going to be nothing in between in like 6 months.
Okay.
Or something close to that.
All right, Megan, you're up with predictions.
Yeah. Well, that's a big prediction to follow. That's a big interesting one, Brett. Yeah, I think prediction wise of the next, with the election here, and then with the new administration settling in January, and I think like the Copyright Office kind of said they were going to get something out to us, like more guidance by the end of the year. It will also be really interesting to look at this more globally. So like, for instance, China is like half the world's patent filings and half the trademark filings are in China. So I think it's like US, China, Europe, we all know is very conservative on a lot of these things. So I think it'll be just trying to figure out globally what happens. But my prediction is like in a year, we're going to be in the same place. We're not going to know anything more. Just a guess.
So somewhere between radical apocalyptic change and static nothingness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
We're somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, rocky road and vanilla. That's what we get.
Isn't that right? We're usually somewhere in the middle, right? Yeah.
Love it.
Great predictions. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining us. This is awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, that was really informative. We should definitely have them back along this journey because I feel like, this like legal, questions come up a lot, especially kind of with the space that we're in within AI, because there's a lot of questions. And I thought that was great. I feel like I learned a lot. I didn't know, obviously not a lawyer and, kind of, able to absorb a lot from them. So that was great.
Yeah. I mean, there's two humongous topics that, I think we want to go deeper in. One is, just in AI startups, how you're structuring deal flow, thinking about bringing on more capital, just more around that in operations. And then the IP protections, I think, are just, it's just going to be a quickly evolving space, especially with a new administration coming in. And what does that mean? So yeah, I hope to have, both Megan and Brett back on very, very soon once some of these spaces start to unfold.
Yeah, I feel like we could have a whole episode on patents. Like that one, I was like, oh, wow, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Please, if you are listening, subscribe to the podcast and also check us out on the road. Again, verbe.com/events, and check us out in a city near you. And if you want us to come to you, let us know. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of AI Powered by People. The show is produced by Steve Berkowitz and brought to you by Verbe. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next Tuesday.